Okay, Paula, I think we can go ahead and get started.
Good evening, everyone. We have a few housekeeping rules we'd like to share to ensure that tonight's meeting is a successful one. During this meeting, we will provide information that is specific to and focuses on ATL Zoning 2.0 and the process. We have set aside opportunities for participants to ask questions to our speakers following each presentation. During the Q&A session, please ask one question at a time to allow all questions to be recognized and answered. As you'll notice, everyone is muted. Please use the raise your hand icon in the lower toolbar to request to be unmuted for your question. Speakers will be called in the order in which the hand raised icons are lifted. If you are joining the meeting via telephone, please press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute when your phone number is called. You may also post questions in the chat as we will be answering questions from that feature. Additionally, if you are watching live via YouTube, please post your questions in the YouTube chat. If you're watching the Idea Labs at a viewing party, please share your questions with the facilitator. We will make every effort to answer unanswered general questions asked tonight on the project website's FAQ page. Thank you.
I'm suspecting it's my turn. I was unmuted. This is Tim Keene, Commissioner of City Planning for the City of Atlanta. Just wanted to make a few introductory remarks. Thanks for letting me do that. And thanks to everybody who's joining us tonight, whether you're alone at your computer or at a watch party. Either way, the few things for me. One is that this is an important discussion about zoning in the city and how we might as a community decide that our zoning regulations that affect how things are built in the city, how they might change in the future. We started this process really back in 2016, and this will be mentioned in the presentation tonight, but back in 2016, we started an evaluation of the zoning ordinance, which ended up being called the zoning diagnostic, basically evaluating the 1982 zoning ordinance and how it had been amended since 1982 to see, what's our best path forward to trying to improve the zoning ordinance. That diagnostic said that we ought to do some things relatively quickly, and those were dubbed the quick fixes. The quick fixes were adopted in phases, starting in 2018, and then a second phase in 2019. The quick fixes included some things we're discussing again, which includes the provision for accessory dwellings in single families, some of our single family zoning districts, as well as the creation of a new district called MRNU, which has to do with permitting duplexes and small apartment buildings in single family neighborhoods. So those were created as part of those quick fixes because the zoning diagnostic were saying there's some things we can't wait for a full zoning rewrite to address. Let's address issues having to do with housing diversity and affordability quickly where we can. Hence those quick fixes related to accessory dwellings and small apartment buildings. And then there'll be the longer term comprehensive review of the zoning ordinance and theoretically to rezone the entire city. So that is what kind of starts in earnest tonight with these Idea Labs, is that comprehensive look at the zoning ordinance for more comprehensive changes and theoretically, again, rezoning the entire city. And anytime a city does something of this type, it takes time because it's a very public process that requires lots of people's guidance and ideas and consensus around how we might do that. It's a substantial undertaking. So the diagnostic we did in 2016 said, let's not wait on a few things, which we continue to work on, as you know, with the Atlanta City Design housing proposals that included amendments to those quick fixes having to do with accessory dwellings and small apartment buildings. But let's now get about the business of perhaps rewriting the whole zoning ordinance, and that's going to be a longer affair, which will be discussed in the presentation. One good thing we have in Atlanta's case that not every city has is Atlanta City Design, which was incorporated into the city's charter in 2017. And I say that's something most cities don't have because it is a unique way to look at city planning and design, and suggesting that we don't just need to plan the city, we need to design it. And Atlanta City Design sets forth a framework upon which all of our work is now based, including this, which will also be discussed in the presentation. And that helps us tremendously. It puts us in a position that, as I said, most cities are not in. The fact of the matter is Atlanta is growing like it hasn't before. In 1982, when the last zoning ordinance was adopted, of course, the city's population was declining. It had peaked in 1970 and was about a multi-decade process of declining the population in the city. And now we're now have a population that's greater than that ever in the city's history, and we're growing in a way the city never has. So the opportunity associated with this piece of work, starting with these idea labs, is a very significant one for us as a community, because it has to do with not just adding, it's not about adding regulations, it's really our opportunity to say, really, are the regulations that we have as a city that do deal with land use and development and building, are those regulations resulting in what we want to achieve as a city or not? And that's what this conversation is about, is how do we actually make our regulations more precise and in keeping with the outcomes that we're seeking as a community. And we know issues like affordability and mobility in Atlanta, especially, I'll add sustainability as well, just the dealing with climate change, are ones that all cities are facing and are pretty intractable when it comes to dealing with them in a way that's satisfying to the residents of the city. So this is in this realm, this is an enormous task that we have before us, and one that we appreciate your participating in. I'm going to turn it over now. I'm going to introduce Kieta Holmes, who is the director of the Department of City Planning's Office of Housing and Development, who will kind of take the presentation from here and work with TSW, our lead consultants on this, to take us through the work and the discussion tonight. Does that sound right, Kieta?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Tonight, we, residents, business owners, the consultant team, other stakeholders, and the city together begin a multi-phase process to rewrite the 40-year-old zoning ordinance. Zoning affects every aspect of life, and it is the zoning code that creates the vibrant, active communities across the city we all aspire to have. Tonight, we begin with one of 4 idea labs where we will discuss very general and broad topics, from the process beginnings to topic-specific meetings that may be used in the new zoning ordinance. At the end of every session and over the course of this multi-year process, there will be the opportunity for questions and answers, and in addition, ways to provide comments after formal sessions have concluded. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope that you will remain engaged over the next few years and encourage anyone that you know that is not here tonight to join us for any future session. And with that, I'll turn it over to Caleb.
Great. Thank you very much, Director Holmes. Give me one moment while I share this and share my screen. Hello, everyone. I'm Caleb Rossico, Project Manager for the Atlanta Zoning Rewrite Consulting Team. And I'd like to personally welcome everyone for joining us this evening to have a conversation, start a conversation that's been a long time in the making, namely the update to the City of Atlanta's 40-year-old 817-page zoning ordinance. And I write zoning for a living, and so I understand that this isn't necessarily everyone's idea of how to have a fun Wednesday night. But again, I appreciate the fact that you're here because zoning is so incredibly important in how we think about Atlanta, how we shape Atlanta, and very importantly, how we become the community that we want to be. Before I get started, I wanted to go through a little bit of housekeeping and some of the agenda this evening. Our goal, first of all, is to provide a brief overview of background, the work that we, the consulting team, have been doing to date, and to really get the wider community up to speed. After that, there will be a 15-minute Q&A where Director Holmes and myself answer any questions about the general process. And then finally, we'll conclude with a really interesting survey of some of the work that we've been doing regarding understanding Atlanta's existing physical patterns. We'll have another Q&A after that, some interactive exercises, and then finally break hopefully shortly before 8 p.m. Additionally, before I begin, I did want to recognize and acknowledge that even though I am the only speaker this evening, I am part of a much larger team of zoning experts and legal experts and others who have got us to this point today. That includes both local and national experts. Locally, we have several local zoning attorneys who will be helping us make sure that everything we do conforms to Georgia law and sort of the state of the art. We also have several national code writers involved. Code Studio, who are out of Austin, Texas, will be helping very closely in the codification process. And then certainly UTL and placemakers as well. And then finally, because the depth of this process is so broad and we don't know what all the issues are going to be, we also do have several other technical experts or technical practice areas that we can call upon to help you have conversations about zoning as we need to. So the other thing that I wanted to mention is that even though our team does include both local and national experts, I wanted to personally commit to everyone, and I know many of the people joining us this evening, so it's good to see you all, but I wanted to personally commit to everyone that our team is focused on creating a zoning code that meets the local needs of the City of Atlanta and the diverse neighborhoods in the City of Atlanta. For this to happen, it is incredibly important, as Director Holmes mentioned, to make sure that we meaningfully engage the public at every step of the process. And so I wanted to run through very quickly what some of the ways for folks to follow us are. Most importantly, we've set up a project website, atlantazoning.com. This is a website where we're going to share all the recordings of the meetings, for example, the one this evening, put any materials that are produced, and then finally, when we do have a draft ordinance, have a series of review mechanisms on there. Additionally, if anyone is joining us by phone or doesn't have computer access, we have set up a hotline, 404-546-0116, where you can call us and leave a comment or ask a question. And then, of course, we've set up a zoning email as well, atlzoning2@atlantaga.gov. That email goes both to Director Holmes and me. So if you do have any questions or comments or suggestions, please use the email anytime during the process to get in touch with us. And then finally, as was mentioned before, we do have a series of 4 Idea Labs coming up, 3 additional. And so if you are interested in learning more about hosting a viewing party associated with that, feel free to email us and let us know. And then finally, for those of you who may be traveling or not have access to a computer, we also are streaming live on YouTube. Just search for Atlanta Department of City Planning for access, and it will show up on there. With that said, let's begin with a little bit of background to how we got where we are today. As Commissioner Keene mentioned, zoning is one of the critical tools that is used by city governments and really county governments as well to shape the development patterns in a community. Zoning, which many also refer to as coding, is the set of laws that shape what can and cannot be built in different parts of Atlanta. Atlanta has added zoning since the 1920s, and the city has conducted several significant overhauls since that time. Interestingly enough, though, there are still provisions from the 1929 zoning code in Atlanta's zoning ordinance today. So it's interesting just to think of how something that's over 100 years old is in some ways still shaping the way that we design and build our city today. The last effective update, holistic update of the Atlanta zoning ordinance occurred in 1982, roughly coinciding with the arrival of MARTA. But because zoning is a living, breathing document, the city has made many, many changes to the zoning ordinance since then. Many new SPIs have been created. As Commissioner Keene mentioned, there were a series of quick fixes. And then just really in every city we work in, councils and elected officials find that it's necessary to adopt what are called text amendments throughout the rewrite process to address urgent changes. And then finally, the final thing I wanted to say about zoning is that zoning really is just a tool. And like any other tool, its impact depends on how it's used. Atlanta, like most cities across the country, uses zoning to support various city policies and plans. Now, as of this morning, the zoning ordinance in the city is 817 pages, as I mentioned before, and it includes many standards. Some of these apply everywhere, such as loading requirements or bicycle parking requirements, but other requirements in the zoning code are very specific to particular parts of the city. When a set of standards only applies to a specific geographic area, we tend to call this a zoning district. So if you've ever looked at the Atlanta zoning map, you may have seen R1, R2, R3, SPI, RG. All of these are just zoning districts, which really are a set of area-specific tools applied to a specific part of the city. Now, because the zoning code is 40 years old, with many updates since then, the current ordinance is somewhat confusing, unclear, difficult to use, and really doesn't reflect the state of the art of how cities and counties and other governments are creating modern, user-friendly zoning code. And as a result, we anticipate that the bulk of this effort will be refining the actual text of the zoning ordinance, looking at the zoning districts, identifying opportunities to perhaps consolidate or revise or create new districts, but really focus on the words, the legal framework, the set of regulations that sets the foundation. Additionally, we know that there are many other parts of the Atlanta Code of Ordinance that we're going to have to coordinate with. Zoning is one section of the city code, but in Atlanta, we know that things like trees, which are not handled by the zoning ordinance, are also incredibly important. So we're going to coordinate with the tree protection ordinance. We're going to coordinate with the stormwater ordinances and the stream protection ordinances and make sure that whatever happens in the updated zoning code has the proper amendments made to the other code sections as well, because they do all interact. The second part of what we call zoning is the zoning map. This is the map that is on file at the city clerk's office that shows where the different zoning districts apply across Atlanta. Now, typically when cities update their zoning ordinance like we're doing, they don't make drastic changes to the zoning map other than perhaps updating names of districts, perhaps consolidating districts, perhaps making a few other refinements. And that is, generally speaking, what we envision coming out of this zoning ordinance rewrite process. We may change some district names, we may consolidate, we may update, but we don't envision this process to significantly upset or change the overall zoning patterns of the city. So for example, areas that are industrial today will not suddenly be zoned residential, and areas that are residential will not suddenly be zoned industrial. It'll really be a translation of the current zoning to the cleaned up zoning and a coordinated map. Now, with that said, however, the zoning rewrite consulting team believes very strongly that for zoning processes to be most effective, you need to plan first and then zone. And so we anticipate that as we are together for the next 2 to 3 years, that there will be opportunities that may strategically present themselves to think about more holistic map changes for example, if a certain neighborhood plan is done, or if another, if the CDP, significant CDP update is done. They're done every 5 years, as many of you know. So even though we envision largely a one-to-one translation, again, we're not necessarily precluding other possible changes. With this said, I'd also like to acknowledge the tremendous amount of work that has been already done by the city to get us to where we are today. As Commissioner Keene mentioned, there has been the Atlanta City Design, which is the foundational framework for thinking about not only growth of the city, but also the physical design of the city, the framework for reflecting what makes Atlanta, Atlanta. And so obviously that is something that is truly foundational to our effort. Additionally, however, there are many neighborhood plans. There are many other plans for the city that we need to consider. Implementing and supporting city design through policies and implementation tools is also part of what is going to inform this zoning ordinance rewrite. The city has many policy plans that really are critical to setting the policy framework for growth and development in the city. These include the recently amended Plan A, Atlanta Comprehensive Plan. They include Atlanta City Design, Housing, and Nature, and they even include the Atlanta Transportation Plan. But what's critical about all of these documents, Atlanta City Design and the CDP, is they don't actually have the teeth of law, the force of law behind them. And so that's where the implementation tools of the zoning ordinance, of the tree protection ordinance, of the ongoing Atlanta City Design housing legislation become really, really important. And so as the city implements these various plans and various policies, we will be updated as those processes occur. And very importantly, those that do impact the zoning ordinance will be incorporated directly into this effort when City Council and the mayor approve them. So it's in terms of structure, the zoning ordinance is the large, complicated, slow-moving creature. And cities are made up of many different types of creatures. And so we will incorporate and embody those as we move forward. So one of these implementation tools, as I mentioned, is the zoning rewrite. And this is really what we're here to talk about today. This is what our team is going to be focusing on. The city, as Commissioner Keene mentioned, has already made tremendous progress over the last 5 or more years in thinking about updating its zoning ordinance. It has laid the foundation for where we are today with the zoning ordinance diagnostic, which is on the project website. You can review that, which lays out literally hundreds of largely technical changes to the zoning ordinance that could occur to make it more user-friendly, more consistent with city policies. There have been the quick fixes, again, which are envisioned as low-hanging, easier fruit. And then the ongoing Atlanta City Design housing, which, as I mentioned, we will incorporate the outcome of that process into this bigger effort. But we're really now at the beginning of the largest, most critical piece of the process, which is actually doing the holistic update to the regulations. And this is going to take time. I want to let the public know that the process of rewriting and changing a citywide zoning ordinance is not a quick process, and it's not an easy process, and it requires a tremendous amount of public engagement, public feedback, and sometimes getting very in the weeds on specific aspects of zoning. And so our goal as code writers is to ensure that this final piece, this actual rewrite of the code, is structured in such a way that we use it to have the difficult conversations that need to have before any adoption is considered, that has the extensive public engagement that is envisioned. And so we can have those conversations before anything is actually ready to go for City Council. And so we've set up a structure that I'm going to go through very briefly now that, generally speaking, starts early on with very general high concepts, which for some people may be moving too slowly. But then over time, at the speed of trust, at the speed of people being able to understand what is really a complicated topic, gradually moves towards more specific regulation. And so the first phase of that process is the part that we've been working on largely behind the scenes for several months now. This is the research and analysis phase, where our team has looked at understanding how the zoning ordinance rewrite can in fact align with the future city envisioned by Atlanta City Design. And so our team has read the city design document and the addendums. We have read various city plans, and we have begun to identify where different aspects of the zoning, the substance, meaning the actual regulations, the procedures, and the format could better align. Additionally, we have reviewed many background documents. We've read through the zoning ordinance from front to back, all 817 pages of it. We've reviewed the diagnostic again. And very importantly, we've read the CDP, both the historic CDP and the recently adopted CDP. We've reviewed neighborhood plans, and then we've looked carefully at other regulatory initiatives that are going to inform this process. For example, the short-term rental, the tree ordinance, and other city changes that we're going to have to be aware of in order to really do this process justice. Additionally, one of the most exciting things that we've done, and really the focus of tonight's meeting, is we feel very strongly as a consultant team that in order to truly update the zoning code in a way that reflects the unique character of Atlanta neighborhoods, the unique values of different Atlanta neighborhoods, that we need to truly understand their existing patterns of physical buildings and physical use. And so later on, UTL is going to provide a broad overview of what the findings there. And then finally, because public engagement is so absolutely critical to this process, we have worked on refining the public outreach strategy. We've developed the project website, we've prepared the idea labs, and then we've set up a very robust framework for as many as 40 public meetings to talk about just zoning over the next couple of years, in addition to some pop-ups. And so we are absolutely committed to a process that is participatory, a process, again, that is at the speed of trust, and a process that includes all voices and making sure that this code is updated. Additionally, phase 2 has been about putting together some of the technical material that our team is going to need to actually write the ordinance. These include developing potential alternatives for consideration of how we might actually structure the zoning code, the physical way that we lay out the ordinance, not necessarily any of the regulations in it, but the organization into articles and chapters and paragraphs. We've also had some alternatives where we've thought about procedure and then about format. Additionally, from that, we have identified that there are areas which, from our perspective, really warrant more discussion early on, more discussion in this stage, so that the greater Atlanta citizenry can be aware of ideas that may be working in Atlanta, may be working in other communities for consideration. And so we've put together these series of 4 idea labs where we've brought in guest speakers from across the country on various topics related to zoning and development to throw out ideas for consideration. Some of these ideas might be obvious to everyone. Sure, we want to do this. We know we want to do this. Others might be more provoking. And we've done this because we want to get you, the greater Atlanta community, the people who are affected by zoning, to start to think about what could be before we actually determine a path to get there. And so we'd like to encourage you to think about these as food for thought, to let you know what's going on, but really not to be specific in any definitive regulation. Everything you hear in the Idea Lab is just that. It's asking you an area for which conversation should occur. And so again, we've got 4 of those. We're going to talk about existing patterns tonight. On November 9th, we're going to be talking about sustainability and how COVID-19 has changed sort of cities and zoning. On the 16th of the month at 6 p.m., we have a session on urban ecology and mobility and transportation. And then finally, we end it with what I think is going to be really the most interesting idea lab, which is about how do we in Atlanta, and how have other cities physically organized very complicated zoning regulations so that they can be user-friendly, easy to administer, but so that they can also preserve and reflect the unique diversity of city neighborhoods. And so Code Studio out of Austin, Texas is going to give a wonderful overview on what some tools might be to consider there. And then finally, after all that is done, after we've had a series of idea labs, after we've heard from you, after we've had conversations, we are then going to begin the process of actually determining what this new zoning ordinance is going to be like. And so we are going to have a series of workshops where we focus on specific topics with specific ideas for consideration. For example, if we do want regulations that can reflect neighborhood character, we'll have a workshop to talk about that and see how we set up the tools. But these are really going to be about exploring the advantages and disadvantages of different approaches to zoning. And again, making sure that we're on track with general ideas before we write anything, so that by spring of next year, several months from now, the consultant team will, in collaboration with the Department of City Planning, have a roadmap for how we're actually going to write the code. A roadmap that talks about the structure of the ordinance, meaning what goes there, where do we think we're going to make a lot of changes, where do we think we're going to primarily carry forward current regulations, there will actually be a table of contents that shows how the current zoning will get organized into this new structure. And then a series of legal, really largely legal considerations for how do we deal with nonconformities, vesting, and all those other things. And then additionally, I wanted to mention that only after that's occurred, only after we have agreed upon the approach and we vetted that with Atlanta and Atlanta city staff and Atlanta neighborhoods and all of you, only after then do we actually begin the year to 18-month process of pulling together the draft zoning ordinance. And so the process of writing this ordinance is going to take time. When you look at other cities, most of them do take 18 months to 2 years to just write the draft and iterate the draft with the city. And so we are committed to engaging the variety of Atlanta stakeholders at multiple times throughout the process, at least 36 meetings plus 4 pop-ups to have these conversations. As we have a first draft on a certain part of the code, we may say, okay, we're going to have a conversation to talk about residential districts, and then we'll present those, we'll get your feedback, and we'll continue to do that a variety of times for both the zoning map and the ordinance as we move forward. And then finally, as part of that, we know that pictures can be really powerful in neighborhoods and developers and everyone understanding what a zoning requirement means. And so our team of architects who we have on board is going to be working with the Department of City Planning, and actually with, we're going to be doing a call for potential sites. We are going to seek to identify representative properties in Atlanta where we can actually think about testing zoning ideas, so that if there's a vacant tract in your neighborhood, or if there's an old shopping center in your neighborhood that you'd like to envision how zoning changes might work, we will actually model that without a real development proposal in a very low pressure environment and see how different alternative regulations might work. I think that's going to be a really powerful tool in helping us to understand that. And only after we've done all that, only after we've had 40 public meetings and a variety of modeling and pop-up exercises, and only after we've convinced everyone, the diverse stakeholders of Atlanta, the diverse neighborhoods of Atlanta, that you all support this code and you all support the direction that we're going, and we've had the hard conversations in a low pressure environment, only then, when we've had those conversations, will the official adoption process begin. So with that said, I would like to thank you very much for allowing me to provide this background on the process. I'd now like to open it up for any questions from the audience. Then Director Holmes and myself will answer them for about 15 minutes. Thank you.
The first question is from Jim Martin.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, sir, you are. Go ahead.
Okay, I couldn't find the button to do it, but I guess you did it for me. My question is in regard to this notion of form versus use-based zoning. I have heard a lot of city planners talk about use-based zoning as if it's sort of obsolete, but it has always seemed to me that what is obsolete is that we have not updated our notion of use to reflect how uses have changed since the zoning code. And in regard to our zoning code, for example, what was a drive-in is now a drive-through. What was a service station is now a massive regassing facility. And those uses are not sort of reflected in the zoning code. Are we thinking in terms of this zoning rewrite that in fact this use-based zoning is obsolete, or are we considering the notion that perhaps we should be simply updating our concept of use?
Yeah, Mr. Martin, you're absolutely correct. We are when you review the diagnostic, we believe that based on that we need to have a process that reflects form and reflects the quality and value of design, but absolutely continues to regulate based on land use. As you pointed out, Atlanta has uses in their use definitions that I don't even know what half of them are. And so our team believes that part of this process will be making sure that we have modern uses, that we update and define every single use in the city so that Director Holmes has clarity, and that very importantly, we incorporate some of these modern uses. I like to use the example of doggy daycare. You know, doggy daycare is one of those things that everyone knows what it is, but when you look in the zoning ordinance, there's a definition of daycare and there's a definition of veterinary clinic. And so what is it? And so you're absolutely correct. The use provisions, and I might add the use standards, will be completely updated as part of this process.
Yes, our current zoning code.
Jim, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to cut you off and let the others ask questions. If you have any other comments for either me or for Caleb, you can just send them to us via email and we'll get a response to you, okay?
No problem.
Next question is from Randall Lausenheiser.
Perfect.
Go ahead, sir.
So the best rezoning that I've ever taken part of was the Midtown rezoning into SPI 16 and 17, where they did visual preference surveys, where the public really had a lot of input. Are you planning on the public giving a lot of input? And I don't know if you're familiar with the visual preference surveys that were done at that time, but is that what you're planning on doing? Because that's really what I'm hearing is trickle down, but what really works is trickle up.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely correct. I actually worked with Tony Nellison on the Midtown Alliance blueprint back in the 90s. We do anticipate that there will be several types of conversations that really have to happen visually, especially if part of what we focus on is the areas that haven't had as much progressive sort of zoning updates as Midtown, like some of the major corridors. I think that graphics are extremely powerful and that visualization tools will be critical, especially if the city thinks about perhaps thinking about commercial zoning and commercial zoning districts. You know, do we really need some of those kind of districts in the city anymore? And visual preference surveys can absolutely be part of that.
Next question is from Jonathan Miller.
Hi, good evening. Jonathan Miller, Emmett Park and NPUN. I am of two minds about this. On one hand, I've finally figured out the zoning code. I think it took me 20 years, but I think I finally figured it out. And so I'm loath to have you change it because I won't be able to find anything. On the other hand, of course, it's probably well past necessary. So with that idea, I would like to put in a plug for including, as the process goes along, building the user guide, because we can have the best zoning code ever, but if no one knows how to get to it, and use it, it won't do the job that we want it to. So that is my first initial thought on what else needs to be done as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. And Caleb and I are in complete agreement on that topic. The next speaker is Vicky Kidd.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions. The first is I'm wondering what kind of efforts are going into making zoning conversations, which I know can get very technical in the weeds, accessible to folks that don't have a planning background, and kind of going along with that, what kind of efforts are going into bringing diverse communities into this multi-year process.
Well, you're absolutely correct. One of the things that we're striving for as we put together the outreach process is a way to talk about zoning without talking about zoning. Unfortunately, many of the ideas at some point do become pretty technical, but our outreach team, Content Consulting, has developed a public involvement plan where we hope that these conversations can occur in a way that that regular folks understand. Additionally, I'm not sure if you've seen if you were had any of the collateral material come to you, but we actually are developing a campaign for people who don't care about zoning to understand why it matters. And so we've sort of taken the idea of Atlanta influences everything, and Ben Joyner is one of the folks who is helping us think about this with a zoning influences everything campaign. And so we've identified ways that we can talk to people about childcare. Why if they care about childcare, they should care about zoning. Why if they care about housing, they should care about zoning, or small businesses and care about zoning. So we're still developing the messaging, and we're still developing exactly how we do that, but we are in complete agreement. This has to be as broad as possible. And very importantly, it has to reach as many Atlantans as we can, because they are all affected by zoning, whether they realize it or not.
Zachary, before I butcher your name, I'm just going to call Zachary. Go ahead.
Yes, Zach Adrianson's MPUX and Capital View. And first, just want to say that Caleb and Ms. Holmes are the two people I always go to for my zoning questions. So I'm so excited for both of them to be managing this process moving forward. I think they'll do a great job. My question, though, is just a little bit of an informational question. In your presentation, you mentioned that there were parts of the existing code that dated from the 1920s. What portions of the code are those? And do you have any more information on that?
Oh gosh, you're gonna.
So there's portions of the code that talk about guest housing, and portions that talk about innkeepers or some type of. Those are the kinds of things that Caleb's referring to, I think.
Yeah, and even Zach, the example of alley setbacks, the provision to allow you to count half of the alley towards your setback is actually in the 29 code. So that's probably one that we would carry forward. But it was just very interesting. As I read the 29 code, I saw regulations that were here today. And in fact, literal language that had carried over.
Next speaker is James Burge.
Yes. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Okay. Zoning decisions affect both the residents who currently live in the community and also the residents that do not currently live in the community but would like to, because zoning affects the housing stock that will be available in the future. How in the community engagement process do we account for the preferences of these people along with the preferences of existing residents?
I think the most important thing is to listen to everyone and consider everyone's perspective. There are those who would like to have single family structures, those who would like duplexes, those who would like triplexes, those who like living in very tall high rises. And I think if we, the planners, the community, everyone that's involved in this process would think about it in life cycles, it would serve us best. If you would think about where someone would live if they were starting out in their career, where they would move to if they just recently got married, and then where they would move to if they had one or two children, and then where they would move to once they become an empty nester, and then where they would move once they become a retirement age. If we think about it in those types of concepts, you could capture all the different types of housings that would serve someone across their entire life cycle. Next question is from House of Ramirez.
Oh, hi. So it's not really a question, it's a comment. I just wanted to thank the team and also Caleb for bringing this to us. I did see in the messages that in the chat that it's a 40 meeting series to obtain input from us, the residents, small business owners, just everyone. It impacts us all. So I want to go ahead and just thank you guys, because this is something that we should be aware of and we're not, and this will help us and also in turn help the study or help the meeting. So thanks.
Thank you. And we'll take the last two questions before we move on to the next portion. The next to last question will come from Paul McMurray.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes, sir.
Caleb, I was reading some of your technical information, and it seems that you seem to deem the fact that there are a lot of non-conforming uses as a problem with the current code. When I would suggest that maybe it's an evolutionary process and it's actually a success of the code, because what it's telling you is what might have been present in the past did not work. Therefore, that's why it became non-conforming. Just like the issue with missing middle housing. Maybe missing middle housing is missing because it did not work in the past. And the second question I have, what's totally missing from any analysis is a way to deal with adversarial, industrial, and commercial uses next to largely minority neighborhoods. Like basically in the Jonesboro corridor, we have like 3 towing services within in one MPU. Is there any way that we could do reparative zoning such that a lot of the industrial zoning was done for racist reasons? And I don't see anything in here that can somehow redevelop those areas such that the surrounding zoning actually works for the community instead of being a negative effect that makes people want to leave. Mm-hmm. And everything in this process is totally focused on largely residential zoning. And I suspect the ultimate goal is to replace single family zoning with MRMU, unless you're politically connected. So that's my issue.
Yeah, Mr. McMurray, I appreciate your comments. I wanted to give a couple of things. You are correct. When I mentioned nonconformity, it's important for us to recognize what impacts any zoning changes may have on nonconformities because they are highly regulated by the law. You're also absolutely correct that nonconformities are not a problem when they are things that in fact the community does not want. But as you're going to see in a moment, we would wager, and I would wager, that many of the neighborhoods that people love in Atlanta, West End, Inman Park, Grant Park, Collier Heights, they don't actually conform to the zoning today. So I think there does need to be some conversation, and we want to have this conversation about what should be non-conforming and making sure that the regulations fit. And then finally, your comment about this process not looking at all zoning districts, I think you may be confusing what we're here to talk about, which is the full zoning rewrite with the Atlanta City Design Housing. We are going to look at every zoning district, including I districts. We're going to look at creating tools that may not even be needed today, but could be needed 5-10 years down the road. And then finally, as I did mention during my comments, zoning is primarily about supporting city policy. So it really is critical to think about making sure that the existing city policies, like the Jonesboro Road Redevelopment Plan, like the CDP, like other city documents, that's where the actual changes the proposed zoning changes are addressed. Because again, the idea is you plan first and then you make the map change, and you make the map change using this new, more user-friendly code that we've written, hopefully 3 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you. The last question for this period will come from Nina Gentry. Please remember that we will have another question and answer period after the presentation. Go ahead, Nina.
Thank you, Kieta, and Caleb, thank you both and everyone else on the team on this call. I have to echo Jonathan Miller's comment about a new zoning code and figuring out where you go for what. I've been working with this code since the mid-'80s, so I wholly endorse a user guide. But the one thing I hope you're going to be looking at, and I presume you will be, is looking at, for example, the single-family residential districts, where they have the same, basically, the only difference has to do with lot size, setbacks, etc. And you can be able to fold them into one chapter and have a table, like was done in some of the quality of life ordinances. And that can also be done, I believe, for some commercial zoned areas, which I think would help greatly in the ease of usability. And I'm excited about this process and hope I can attend every session. And I thank you and your team for all your hard work.
Thank you. And I do want to give a 30-second plug. If anyone is interested in the kind of things that Ms. Gentry just mentioned, the final session, number 4, the one I said I'm really excited about, is going to be just about just that kind of topic. How could we do that? So I encourage everyone to attend it. All righty. Well, what we're going to do now is turn it over to our consultants, Util, to have a presentation on some of the work on the existing Atlanta patterns. And before we do that, I did want to let everyone know in advance that this is there is a lot of data here. And so as you're watching the video, please know that there is a companion video on the project website. And more importantly, all of the written materials that Util is going to talk about are on there. And so you can go there, review your neighborhood, review your different part of the city, and see the actual analysis as has been done there. This is an incredibly rich piece of information that I think is going to be so important to our conversations, but it is a lot. So please don't feel that you're missing something if you don't catch everything the first time around. So with that said, we can play the video.
Hi, I'm Matthew Littell. I'm a principal at Util. We're an urban design and architecture firm that is part of the zoning rewrite consulting team.
Hi, I'm Andrea Baena. I'm an urban designer and architect at Util.
And my name is Zoe Mueller. I'm an urban planner and designer at Util.
This presentation is intended to complement the summary video of our work, analyzing Atlanta's built patterns, and to help you get into a little bit more detail about how to look at our work and how to understand some of the analysis that we've done. We'll walk you through the steps that led us to the key findings and show you how to navigate the complete report, which contains all the different study areas in case you want to explore this topic further. We will also discuss how this analysis will be used to inform the broad zoning update. So why was it important to analyze the existing urban patterns? We'll start by explaining how this analysis fits into the planning context and the vision that Atlanta City Design has developed, which seeks a balance between growth areas and conservation areas. We'll also introduce some important definitions, including what a pattern is, what a disconnect between current zoning and the existing fabric might mean. And finally, we'll discuss why these disconnects exist and why we want zoning to reflect existing patterns and also allow for changes. By 2050, the city will nearly triple its existing population, growing from just over 500,000 today to 1.2 million, according to Atlanta City Design. Growth will occur at different intensities in the growth areas and in what we call the conservation areas. The consultant team identified that most growth areas already have newer zoning districts that produce better outcomes in terms of design, walkability, and other important metrics. That's why we felt it was important to carefully review patterns of conservation areas which often lack these protections, but which are so important to Atlanta's identity. The challenge in conservation areas is to preserve the character and ecological value in low-density residential areas while allowing for moderate growth that meets the needs of changing demographics, including a more diverse and aging population. Unlike growth areas, most conservation areas have not seen any meaningful updates to their zoning since the current code became effective in the early 1980s. In neighborhoods across the city, growth has shown that the type of development that is allowed under current zoning is not always consistent with the Atlanta city design vision of allowing growth in a way that respects existing patterns, especially its idea of urban, suburban, and rural conservation areas. So what is a pattern when we talk about zoning? Over many decades, the built environment in Atlanta has evolved in different ways in different neighborhoods. The size of the buildings, their uses, the spacing between them and the street, and their placement in their lots. These have all grown into what we might call a pattern, which imparts different parts of Atlanta with their own character and make Atlanta what it is today. Many of these are directly regulated or shaped by the Atlanta zoning ordinance. This is why it is important to look closely at the patterns found in Atlanta today before considering new regulations that could affect them. So why are there disconnects between the current zoning and existing fabric? Many areas were built before the current zoning ordinance of 1980, which sought to impose a kind of more suburban ideal on Atlanta. Existing zoning district standards more closely reflect newer suburban development patterns. Zoning regulations were designed at a specific period in time. Demographics and lifestyles have evolved at a different speed than the regulations and have changed much over the last 40 years. So what do we mean when we say non-conformity? This is an important term that we'll be using a lot in this presentation. When a property does not meet requirements of the zoning ordinance, it is known as a non-conformity, which comes in two forms. A form non-conformity, which relates to the shape or size or physical properties of a building, and then use non-conformities, which deals with what kinds of uses take place inside the building. Form nonconformities, as I mentioned, occur when the physical shape of a building do not align with the requirements of the zoning. These issues might include the size of the lot, something we call lot size, lot coverage, which is the ratio between the size of the building's footprint and the lot that it sits on, floor area ratio, which is a term that is used to measure building intensity and is essentially the ratio of all the floor area inside the building to the lot size. The building height, front, back, and side setbacks, which is the distance between the building and its property line along its edges, and then lot frontage, which is the width of the shortest side of the parcel facing a street. This is an example of a residence in Westview, and you'll see that it is part of a series of very skinny lots, which technically do not conform to the zoning code because their frontage is too small. However, as you notice, that this building is part of a series and part of a pattern. So this is an example of where there might be a disconnect between the zoning code and some of the built traditional fabric in Atlanta. A use nonconformity occurs when requirements related to the way the building is used are not met. And these might include land use, for instance, residential uses, commercial uses, industrial, mixed use, etc. or the number of units per parcel. So for instance, a single family versus a duplex or a multifamily use. This neighborhood scale commercial corner storefront is in North Highland, which is a residential district that does not allow commercial uses. You can see that this is a commercial use which has been here for a long time and is currently licensed as a sort of legacy use, but another example of where the current zoning does not quite match some of the traditional uses in the neighborhoods. So why do we want to support existing patterns and allow growth that is compatible with local character? Several reasons. One is to support city plans, including Atlanta City Design, the CDP, and assorted neighborhood plans. Another reason is that Atlantans love their neighborhoods. They love the character, they love the way they are, and want to preserve those traditional patterns. Local patterns are adapted to the climate and the landscape. Trees are a very important part of this. Other benefits of traditional neighborhood patterns include walkability, transit proximity, and all other kinds of benefits that relate to more traditional neighborhood layouts with a certain kind of low-rise single-family density. And I think finally, one of the reasons is that we want to keep Atlanta, Atlanta. We want to reinforce the character of the neighborhoods that's made plain through some of the patterns that have developed over the decades.
Thank you, Matthew. Now we're going to talk about the method. This work consisted on a nested scale analysis, which was both quantitative and qualitative. The citywide pattern analysis was the first thing, which led to the selection of representative neighborhoods with a high number of nonconformities or disconnects between the current zoning and existing patterns. The patterns identified at the city scale were unpacked at the neighborhood, block, and building scales. At the neighborhood scale, the second step, we analyzed similarities and differences between representative areas in relation to use mix, parcel size, units per parcel, nonconformities, and building type patterns. At the block scale, we studied both central and transitional representative blocks and their potential to preserve neighborhood character while still accommodating appropriate growth. Finally, at the building scale, we analyzed representative buildings and documented lessons learned on how controlled and context-sensitive growth could be achieved with desirable building elements and urban design standards. We did this analysis using a combination of site visits and computer analysis from various public and private sources. The analysis looked at many things, as you can see here, which include development history, nonconformities and variances, parcel, block, and street patterns, character and building type patterns, and setbacks. We used a tool that planners call spatial data analysis, which basically consists of taking all of these things and visualizing them on maps at different scales. Now we're going to go through the key findings at each one of these scales.
Great, thanks, Andrea. So I'm going to look at some of the first analysis that we did. So this was the city scale analysis. And for this analysis, we really started with what sort of Andrea already listed, which is a lot of data that gave us sort of a broad sense of what some of the focus areas might be for further analysis, including things like variances, nonconformities, parcel, block, and street patterns. So the main question that we had going into this scale of analysis was where the current zoning does not reflect existing traditional patterns of lot size and use. So this is what we have defined as conformity. So what we were really looking for is where throughout the entire city of Atlanta could we zoom in to really get into more detail and start to unpack these disconnects between zoning and existing patterns. So what this looked like for the city scale analysis was sort of three pieces. So the first was really to get into some levels of sort of alignment between Atlanta city design, between the vision that was set forth by that document and the existing urban patterns and zoning districts. So to understand how well they were lined up with one another and where there were sort of areas where there wasn't alignment. The second piece was to look specifically at nonconformity in terms of both form and use for every attribute that we could measure and document at the citywide scale. And this gave us a sense of where there were sort of areas of friction between existing zoning and existing built patterns. And then finally, once we identified some of those areas of friction, we then sort of looked at a couple of other layers of information and qualitative and quantitative metrics to understand whether these areas were representative of the full range of different patterns in the city of Atlanta and the different sort of communities and demographics of those patterns. So with that, I'm going to start walking you through some of this work that we did. So for the conservation areas, which like we said earlier, were our focus, there are three types. There's urban, suburban, and rural. And for these three different areas, there are sort of different issues start to crop up. And in particular, we focused our analysis on the urban conservation areas because those are most likely to experience higher growth pressure because of their proximity to the centers and corridors that are identified as growth areas. So you can understand that there might be a little bit of additional pressure on them, and we want to make sure that they're ready to accommodate that change and growth. So to assess the nonconformity, we looked at areas where there were things like commercial, industrial, or multifamily uses in zones that only allowed single family, for instance. We also looked at areas where there were more dwelling units than were allowed in the zoning ordinance. So you can see here in red the areas that pop out as areas where there's non-conforming use. And then in addition, and you can see there's a lot more on the map here, in addition to use, we also looked at non-conforming form. So those are the physical attributes that do not line up with what zoning allows. And here you can see that there's a much wider spread of areas that have non-conforming form. And in particularly wanted to call attention to the fact that over 90% of all of this sort of red that you see on the map here, all of the non-conforming form, over 90% of that comes from, in part, below minimum lot size. So we know that that's a really big area for sort of reconsidering the zoning ordinance going forward. Right?
And we can see that nonconformities, both in form and in use, are concentrated mostly in the urban conservation areas, which are those areas with a darker black boundary closer to the city center.
So with all of that analysis, we identified these 19 areas of friction between the existing zoning and the built patterns. And this is considering both the use nonconformity and the form nonconformity, as well as things like the dominant zoning, the council districts, and the neighborhood planning units. So this is really a way to understand the wide range of neighborhoods in which this nonconformity is showing up. And in particular, we looked at 15 different character elements that helped us to assess and describe the sort of range and diversity of these different neighborhoods. And we used those to sort of visualize this. For each of those 19 friction areas, we assess them relative to these sort of elements of history, of threshold and growth potential, urban fabric, their parcel level physical patterns, and their policy and regulatory context, so that we could be sure that we had a representative set of 19 study areas. You can see here, these areas, are spread all across the city. They cover north, south, east, and west, and they capture a wide range of the urban, rural, and suburban conservation areas. And then finally, also zoning. They have a range of different existing zoning districts so that we can see those relationships play out.
We developed a library of building types, which was essential in the following scale analysis, both for the neighborhood and the block scale. They allowed us to see what types of buildings are predominant at each one of the areas of analysis. By building type, we refer to general groups of buildings with similar massing, size, setbacks, and building elements, such as porches, shop fronts, balconies, etc. Use is not always associated with a building type. In fact, in Atlanta, there are many examples where the use of a building has changed over time, such as the conversion of a historic school to apartments or former houses to offices. For this reason, building type most often reflects a building's original use and design. The line between some building types is also often blurred, such as a small apartment building that is visually indistinguishable from a single-family house. Here you can see the different building type categories that we identified for the conservation areas, both residential and a few non-residential in the bottom. So for the neighborhood scale analysis, the second scale, the main question that we asked ourselves is, what are the finer grained patterns that are found in these 19 representative areas that we identified at the city scale? And do these patterns align with existing zoning regulations? And which one of these study areas have more disconnects and why? So we will quickly walk you through a sample study area. In this case, we're going to see the West End, Westview neighborhoods. If you're interested, you can also take a look at the fine grained patterns across all of the 19 study areas in the complete existing pattern analysis report, which you can find at the website. We'll show you where at the end of this presentation. So for all of these study areas, we did a series of diagrams. We're going to walk you through the use diagram first. All of these graphics at this neighborhood scale contain the boundary of the study area in a black dashed line. We highlight arterial roads, the belt line, if it appears close to the study area. And we also highlight the growth areas in gray. And in this first diagram, you will see color-coded the land uses and the parks, as well as red dots for parcels that do not conform in use, meaning, for example, that they might be zoned as single family, but in reality contain a multifamily or a commercial or industrial or some kind of other different use. Parcel size. In this diagram, we are showing the different lot sizes, also with a color code, and a red dot on all of the parcels whose size is below the minimum allowable size. Parcel size degree, we're analyzing the degree of lot size nonconformity here. Lots shaded in orange are below the minimum lot size, but just by a little bit, by 5% or 10%. And then lots shaded in dark shades of red are significantly non-conforming in lot size. Units per parcel. In shades of blue, you can see an increasing number of dwelling units per parcel. And again, red dots on those that have more dwelling units than allowed in their respective zoning district. Nonconformity. This diagram illustrates the overall lot size, building coverage, floor area ratio, and use nonconformities. And we distinguish between lots that have only form nonconformity, only use nonconformity, or both form and use nonconformities. And finally, here you can see the color-coded building type mix, which includes the categories that were described before.
So from that scale, we next went to the block scale analysis. And in this case, we were able to look into what are the setbacks, the lot coverage, parking placement, circulation, and building use patterns at the block scale in these areas that had many nonconformities when we were looking at them in the neighborhood and city scale. And beyond that, we were also able to start to look at how these patterns relate to existing zoning regulations in greater detail. So just like the previous scales, we were sure to include a representative set of study blocks, and we looked at everything from the degree of nonconformity to where in the city they were. We wanted to make sure we covered all 4 quadrants of the city. And we also wanted to make sure on a more sort of micro scale that we were looking at both central and transitional blocks, so that we were understanding the patterns in different contexts. For this sample, we're going to walk you through a block within the Westview West End neighborhood, so the same neighborhood that we just saw before. And this one is what we would call a transitional block. So it's right at the edge of a growth area. It's also close to the Atlanta Beltline. And so you can see that relationship play out in the study area that we look at. This just gets you a little bit oriented here. At the top of the page, the growth area begins not very far off what we can see in this image. And then you can see that there's also sort of a smaller alley included, and you can see a little bit more of the broader pattern of the blocks. So for this scale, we were able to look at historical context, meaning the era in which different buildings were built. So you can see in the darkest black, the oldest buildings in this block, the ones that were built before 1929. And then in the increasingly lighter shade, we've chosen eras that correspond with major rezoning or major changes in technology and lifestyle, such as the advent of the automobile and how that changed the way that our buildings were built. You then also include the same lot size degree of nonconformity analysis that we showed at the neighborhood scale, so that you can see how that starts to relate to the sort of street network and the sort of smaller patterns within a block and the variation there. We're also at this scale able to look a little bit more closely at intensity. So here you can see the number of units per lot, which are labeled in the circles on top of each parcel. You can then also see the FAR, the floor area ratio, in shades of pink, the darkest meaning higher intensity. And then you can see the numerical representation of the FAR in italics just under the circle. And finally, you can also begin to understand the lot frontage width with the blue lines at the front edges of the parcels. Again, in this case, darker are narrower lot widths. We also were able to look at setbacks at this scale, which is a really significant area of inquiry for the rezoning effort. And in this case, you can see the green dashed line represents the area in which you can build according to the zoning ordinance as it is now. And you can see areas where the buildings sort of protrude beyond that sort of building envelope in dark gray. It's also worth noting that in many cases, these are porches, which are allowed to extend into the setback area. But for the purposes of this analysis, we're representing that in this way so you can see how close it gets to the street. This also allows you to see a little bit more about the sort of the building character and the building types and how they relate to one another. And here you can see yellow representing detached houses, green representing carriage houses, and the purple representing walk-ups. Another important piece of the analysis at this scale was looking at circulation. So here you can see the different street types for any given block shown by the color fill of the street itself. In this case, we're looking at all local streets, but in some cases you'll see there will be arterials included as well. Those are larger connection roads. And then when you look into the relationship of those streets to the individual private parcels, you can see how a vehicle would enter from the main street into the parcel itself. That's indicated with a black triangle with the directionality showing how you'd enter. And then you can also see the area that is dedicated to automobile access within the parcel, shaded in sort of that pale purple. And you can also see alleyways, which is an important aspect of the sort of circulation for many blocks in the city. In some cases, those alleyways are no longer in use, in which case you'll see them in the sort of outlined hatch, like you can see in sort of the lower half of this block here, where you have a existing dedicated alley that is inactive or no longer in use. And then finally, and this is, perhaps hard to see at this scale, but this is another piece that was very important about the block scale analysis, which is that we were able to record sort of in great numerical detail some information that typically is not available for consideration. And this is going to make it possible to better understand the specific dimensional qualities of the current patterns as they are, which will be a great resource as we move towards the next phases of the zoning rewrite.
So finally, at the building scale, which was the last scale, we wanted to understand how representative building typologies engage the street and what is the impact that they have on the neighborhood character and the physical neighborhood character. And how could zoning regulations reinforce these patterns that we love in Atlanta while still allowing for some modest growth that benefits people with diverse lifestyles? So we studied in total 29 buildings across the different building type categories. For each building, we asked ourselves how existing density relates to zoning and how the building currently engages the street. We documented this both on a table and on the image overlay that you see on the far right. In the image, we included annotations in blue for observations relevant to crafting future zoning, highlighting things such as how many windows do we have on the building? What are some significant massing and landscape elements? What are the potential differences between front and side expressions for corner lots? How the building mass and placement relates to the lot's topography? And then in green and in red, we marked conformity and nonconformity in relation to setbacks, lot frontage width, and building height. So we're going to go through a few examples. This first one is a historic 1929 lot with a one-story accessory building that was later subdivided into its own separate lot. This is one example of a long-standing historical building that finds itself in nonconformity, as you can see here. This is a mid-block bungalow on a dead-end street with a strong early 20th century pattern. Similarly to the last example, even though to the naked eye, this building appears to fit in perfectly, if you look more closely, it is in fact non-conforming. This building has an ample porch in the front that engages the street. This is a corner lot with a modified bungalow and has a large front porch. This building also dates before 1929 and is not conforming in setbacks between the building and the property lines, both on the front and the side of the lot. It has an ample front porch that has been partially enclosed. And on the side, as you can see here, there's a driveway with an area for parking behind a fence. This is a mid-block ranch with a strong 1960s pattern. And similarly to most of the houses along the street, it is a post-automobile development with the presence of a driveway in front, which leads to an open-air carport under a roof extension. Even though it is conforming in front, sides, and rear setbacks, it does not meet the minimum required lot width. This is a newer example, a recent development, which conforms to all setbacks, but does not conform to floor area ratio and to lot size. Interestingly, even though there's a dominance of a driveway and garage doors on the ground floor in the front facade, the building does engage the street with the second-story balcony that we see in the front facade. This is a mid-block walk-up with dual porches, balconies, and a grand approach that reflects the pre-World War II pattern of the block. Even though several buildings in the block follow this pattern, there is a level of non-conformity in setbacks. And finally, this is the last example we're going to see. And again, you're welcome to see all the other 29 buildings that we studied in the full report. This is an example of the quintessential one-story corner shop in an urban conservation area built before 1929. And it does not meet any setback or lot coverage requirements under current zoning regulations. So after doing all of this analysis at the 4 different scales, we found some interesting takeaways. I know it has been a lot of technical content. And in these takeaways, we want to really think about how this analysis could be used moving forward. So first, suburban zoning. The current R1 through R5 zoning in Atlanta's conservation areas is suburban in its conception, and it does a good job at supporting suburban patterns. However, in rural and urban conservation areas, these suburban patterns do not align with existing patterns. The zoning ordinance, therefore, does not reflect the existing patterns of all of the Atlanta neighborhoods, especially urban and rural ones, and does not support the neighborhood and city plans in these areas. Rural disconnect. In rural areas, including part of Buckhead and Southwest Atlanta, extreme topography and other natural features are not considered in the R1 and R2 zoning, which is the lowest density residential zoning, predominant in rural areas. And this can result, therefore, in more grading or tree loss than might otherwise be needed. Similarly, in some places, some rural areas, new houses of 10 or even 15,000 square feet can be built very close to existing, often smaller houses with no transitional protection between the two. Often these large new houses have as much impact as commercial or institutional uses would have. The zoning ordinance provides consideration for impact generated by commercial or institutional uses, but not by the new large houses. Urban disconnect. In urban conservation areas, the disconnect between zoning and build patterns is even greater. In fact, many of Atlanta's urban neighborhoods including almost everyone along or inside the Atlanta Beltline, could not be built today. Current regulations also make it hard to build a compatible development by right. Much of this has to do with the limited number of minimum lot sizes in the R4 and R5 districts, which in turn shape the required setbacks, lot coverage, parking access, and more. It is illegal to build many of Atlanta's most beloved neighborhoods under current zoning. Disconnect in setbacks. The greatest disconnect is in setbacks, especially side setbacks. Most urban neighborhood lots have side setbacks that are far, far less than required by zoning. As a result, it is impossible to build a new home that matches the existing patterns on the street without approval of a variance by the Board of Zoning Appeals. In rural areas, in many cases, setbacks are almost too small. Current setback standards are designed primarily for single-family suburban patterns. There's a higher degree of setback nonconformity in other type of buildings, such as multifamily residential or non-residential buildings. Transitions. The zoning ordinance today does not reflect the traditional methods of transitioning between use. Today, the only option in most of the city is a transitional yard or buffer, when historically a wider variety of transitions options existed, such as alleys, landscaping, walls, and even middle-scaled buildings or uses. Character transcends. One of the main disconnects between existing patterns and current zoning is the use of property. Many pre-World War II neighborhoods in Atlanta contained a fine-grained mix of building types, housing types, and uses, all sharing a common scale, relationship to the street, and form. These patterns can still be seen in areas as varied as Midtown Garden District, Ponce Highland, Vine City, Grant Park, and the West End. But they were once even more common. Today, there are few, if any, tools in the zoning ordinance for neighborhoods like these that want to preserve existing patterns, or even for other neighborhoods that want to establish them. Many historical buildings, like the one you see here, for instance, maintain character while allowing mixed use in this case, or higher densities, and examples such as attached houses, townhouses, walk-ups, etc. So character transcends categories of density and use. Zoning for character. So finally, this analysis found that the current zoning ordinance does not do a consistently good job of shaping the design of buildings, not necessarily from an architectural style or materials perspective, but rather how the buildings engage in the street, handle parking, and relate to surrounding buildings. Atlanta's sometimes extreme topography and beloved tree canopy pose particular challenges that are not fully considered in the zoning regulations. These regulations have an impact on street character and experience of the neighborhood, regardless of the development intensity or the number of units or people per building, and regardless of the architectural style, whether it's modern or historic. Zoning has potential to encourage buildings that contribute to the beloved character by upholding higher standards for engaging the street through urban design standards. So what's next? How are we going to use this analysis to inform the zoning update process? This analysis will be a key tool in understanding how to accommodate growth while preserving what makes Atlanta, Atlanta, by informing an exploration of some of the following tools: updates to existing zoning districts, new and potential zoning standards, and potential test sites that can be used to explore these ideas. We could use the maps, for example, at different scales to test out various scenarios for updated zoning standards. One example would be testing out what would happen if the minimum lot size and the setback requirements were decreased for the higher density residential districts such as R4 and R5. Would there be a higher alignment with existing patterns? Would a character be maintained? Together, the Department of City Planning and us, the zoning rewrite consulting team, look forward to including you in these important conversations. We encourage you to learn more if you're interested. You can visit the website, atlzoning.com. Under the Participate tab, go into Explore and Learn. And here you can find the full report of this analysis, which is divided into 4 parts. As you can see here, the first part including introduction, methodology, and the city scale analysis. The second part including the neighborhood scale analysis and building types. Third part including block scale analysis, and finally the building scale analysis in part 4. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Matthew Littell. I'm a principal at UTEAL. We're an urban design and architecture firm that is part of.
Great. Thank you very much. We'd like to take about maybe 5 to 10 minutes for questions. We are running a bit late here, but we'd love to answer any questions you may have before we get to the interactive exercise. Are there any questions about what UTEAL presented? I know that we were answering quite a few in the chat.
Sure, Caleb. The first question comes from Jim Martin. And we'll take the 5 hands that are raised now just to move us along. Go ahead, Mr. Martin.
Yes, it was sort of implicit in this presentation that zoning nonconformities are a bad thing, but I don't see why they're a bad thing. And so I guess that really kind of boils down to the question, which is that, I mean, I'm concerned with facts on the ground, and if they disagree with pretty maps, so be it. But as long as facts on the ground are good, I'm fine with that. Why are zoning nonconformities a bad thing?
They're not a bad thing. However, if there are parts of the city where there is a predominant pattern, and to match that pattern, you have to go through multiple variances, and communities want to preserve that pattern, then they are a problem.
Next question is from Paul McMurray.
Okay. Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. Again, as I suggested in my remarks, this presentation was totally on residential zoning. There are much other issues like proximity of industrial zoning to especially minority neighborhoods that have health issues involved. I saw nothing in this presentation that had anything to do with it. Secondly, can we have alternative viewpoints? Like I said, the fact that things are non-conforming is not a failure of the zoning law, but a success in that it found out what did not work and made them non-conforming. For instance, Southside redevelopment plan in 2000, in which I was the MPU chairman, we took duplexes out of the area. We didn't do that because we're stupid. We had reasons in that we wanted to promote home ownership and make absentee landlords less powerful in our area, which was a real problem. Finally, I'd like to propose an alternative viewpoint, not that it has to be accepted, but that in the single family core that we push toward having radical uniformity, in that it's one house per lot. And I don't claim that that's the best way, but I don't see that in anything you are presenting. I honestly believe that is the best path forward. Okay. For instance, we did not sign on to this bogus 1.2 million forecast you guys have. All right. Everyone knows Atlanta Regional Commission says it's 793K, which is still growth, but not the I forget the word I used, but, overstated that you're giving us. Okay, we ought to answer a question like, why is the missing middle missing? Okay, because it was not working. And these efforts to put it back in have got to be at least examined. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. McMurray. I would only say you do raise many very good points. This process is about, many of the comments you're talking about are associated with zoning specific properties. And as we said before, zoning specific properties and zoning changes are not what this process is about. This process is about creating tools that neighborhoods can have, that if they decide through a planning process that they want to change the zoning, that they have a mechanism for doing that. There will be many, many, many neighborhoods that want to preserve their single family character. And in fact, when you read the actual documents, you will see that we've in fact acknowledged that many neighborhoods in Atlanta, especially anything built after the 60s, is primarily heavily single family. So I encourage you to please review the material in detail and look at the methodology, and rest assured that this is about creating tools that can reflect the diversity of neighborhoods and give a zoning code that can work for these diverse neighborhoods, but recognizing that the application of zoning changes is a very long-term process that is going to be, if ever, after this.
Thank you, Caleb. Next question, Jonathan Miller.
Hi, I wanted to maybe take a slightly different tact and suggest that something I wrote down: non-conformity equals character. And I guess what I'm going at is that some of the cooler neighborhoods, the zoning code that was enforced upon them after the fact is the problem, as opposed to the character doesn't match the zoning code. So it seems to me that this is a huge opportunity to fix the definitions of the code so it better matches the character. And I think that follows something in the presentation. I was wondering if you might just say a few words on those comments. Thank you.
Well, I think that what you're suggesting again is one of the things that we would like to explore in this process. If you look at the recent zoning codes that have occurred, Ponce Highland, Vine City, English Avenue, they have all created tailored zoning districts that match their existing patterns. And they've done that so that when a home burns down, they don't have to get a variance to build back, or so that homeowners can build things that support that, which is very different from you're seeing in other areas that don't have this. So we believe that there's an appetite for that kind of approach in some areas, and that as a city, we can't keep writing historic districts and SPIs and other new zoning districts for neighborhoods that want to do that.
Last question is from Randall Lotzenheiser.
Okay, well, so what you just brought up, because I was thinking about protecting our neighborhood with an SPI or an overlay, but that's not my question. The question is, there was a great, well, and first of all, I want to thank everyone who's involved in all of this, because you all have done a great job and done a great presentation. But you did a study of a small area of the number of units that were allowed and the number of units that were actually in that block. There are several areas, several R5 districts like Midtown, like Old Fourth Ward, Inman Park. Will you be doing studies on all of those areas showing how many units are allowed on the block and how many units are actually there, and how many non-conforming units are on the block? Because I think that's an important study, and I'm not sure that we would want to rezone to meet that criteria, but I think it's interesting to know that. So I'm just curious if you're going to do that.
Yeah, the Midtown, when you look at the document, Midtown Garden District was in there. We tried to define representative areas, and you're absolutely correct, Mr. Lutzenheiser. We felt that it was important to document those patterns, not necessarily because we would change the zoning, but if there are neighborhoods that want to one day aspire to something like the Midtown Garden District, we don't have the tools to do that today. You know, we have R1 through R5 and then RG, which, you know, is suburban garden apartments, and even the MR districts don't work. So we feel very strongly that if there are communities that are interested in that, or maybe even for a block or two, that we need to know what those patterns are so that we can code accordingly. Because what we have now is our RG districts and our MR districts, they allow stuff that a lot of people find just so out of character with the surrounding, and we feel we're obligated to at least create codes that are available that are actually embedded in what makes Atlanta special.
And that was our last question for this period. Unfortunately, we can't take any more questions. If you have a question that wasn't asked or answered, please provide that to us and we'll try to get an answer to you. And so, okay, we'll move on to the poll questions.
Great. Okay, I wanted to now use this just to get a little bit of reaction, and there have been fantastic comments in the chats. I'm going to be asking folks just to give their gut reaction to a series of questions. The first thing that we wanted to talk about was this idea of physical patterns, the fact that we have a lot of physical patterns that are unique in every neighborhood. There are very few that are alike. And so my question is, how important to you is it that the zoning ordinance rewrite should explore standards that actually could match the existing physical patterns of neighborhoods? Do you think we should look at creating zoning tools that could match those physical patterns? Again, I don't mean what's in the building. I don't mean are there 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 units in it. I mean what it looks like, height, scale, and setback. Is that important to you or not? Let us know using a scale of very important to very unimportant, and of course, no opinion, or you can share your comments in the chat. So we'll give everyone about 10 seconds to respond. Okay. Is everyone seeing? Oh, I guess it's asking me. I'm not going to answer. Okay. Inka, how many folks have, can you show our results? Okay, so a lot of people, it's very important or somewhat important to have codes that match the pattern, recognizing that means many things to many different areas. Great. Well, as a follow-up, I really wanted to get into some of the other conversation we've been having here. If we did create tools that achieve that, what do you think is the best way to apply them? Should we apply them automatically everywhere in the city, sort of based on a review of the patterns? Should we think about only applying them in more urban parts of Atlanta, really from the Beltline in? Or should it be a project that really has to come out of neighborhoods asking to have those patterns put in place? Or do you think we shouldn't do it anywhere? You don't support the concept? Please let us know. So again, we're asking you, if we had tools in the zoning code that could achieve that, how should they be rolled out? Should they be blanket applied or as upon request? Okay, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see. Okay, so a lot of upon request, which I think is not unexpected. Okay, great. And then the next physical pattern question is, if these are ideas that you like, and we recognize that not everyone likes them, we're just here getting gut reactions, there are a lot of potential benefits to changing the lot metrics. Some of those could include that new development might fit in better. There would be fewer variances for people who want to build stuff that fits in. The process could be more predictable, or there would be no input. We're interested in knowing if you think any of those things above are potential benefits, or if you think there are no benefits, or other benefits, in which we ask you to write in the chat. Okay. Alrighty, 5 more seconds. Okay, great. Let's see the results. Okay, again, focus really on the preservation of character, not as much the process. Great. Well, thank you. We're now going to switch tracks and talk about use. So everything I just asked related to the building, what the building looks like, how tall it is, does it have a porch or not, that kind of stuff that Util presented. But as we've also seen, and as we've also seen in the chat, we do have a lot of neighborhoods where the pattern of uses, meaning the number of units in a property, the commercial, that kind of thing, do not match the existing patterns. How important to you is it that the zoning rewrite explore potential new zoning districts that could support the existing non-conforming patterns? I mean, as Ms. Brewer noted in her comments, the areas that do have triplexes for which there's no zoning district today, or quads. Our zoning code goes from single family to large multifamily. How important is to you that we at least create codes that would be available in the future on request to match those patterns? Very, somewhat neutral, somewhat unimportant, very unimportant, no opinion or other. So again, about 10 seconds. Okay, let's see the results. Okay, so bit less, I think, less support here than in the form category, but still definitely an interest in at least having a conversation. We're not committing to anything. We're trying to help us figure out how to organize the conversation. And then finally, similar to the previous question, if we did create districts that could perfectly recreate the Garden District in Midtown, or could perfectly recreate Carroll Street in Cabbagetown, or People Street in the West End, where do you think, how should those apply? Should those be automatic everywhere? Should they only be in certain areas like the urban areas? Should they be areas of the city where the patterns are really out of conflict with the zoning? Or should they only be sort of out of a neighborhood process upon request? Again, as has been noted, there are advantages and disadvantages of nonconformities. Okay, so 5 more seconds. Okay, let's see. Okay, so again, a lot of on request. So it seems that there's definite interest, again, as I imagined, to make sure that any solutions can really be neighborhood based and have the predeterminate neighborhood conversations that would have to occur before any changes. And then finally, with regard to use, again, we'd like to ask you what, if you like these ideas, if you like this idea of creating zoning that better matches the sort of organic nature of some of our neighborhoods, what do you like about it? That it would make them legal again, so that, for example, old corner stores that are zoned residential could actually be used commercially again? Is it that there would be fewer rezonings? Do you like the preservation of existing uses, or are you interested in that it would make a process more predictable? We're curious if you think any of these are benefits, none are benefits, or you have no opinion. Okay. Okay, so let's see the results. Okay, so again, there looks like there might be some interest in looking at the issue of how do we preserve historic corner stores, but again, not a huge amount of interest in sort of this proactive approach that doesn't have neighbor conversation. And then my final question, and again, this is setting the foundation for some of the stuff we're going to talk about on the 4th meeting. There is a way that we could write a zoning code that would allow neighborhoods and the city to zone separately between use and form. So for example, if you had a neighborhood where every building, regardless of what was in it, was effectively a detached house, we could code for that form as a form standard. And then independently, we could have separate use standards associated with that. So for example, in one neighborhood, that house form could be only single family in areas where that is the pattern that the community and the city wants to continue. But in other areas, again, I'll use Cabbagetown, where you have houses that actually have commercial uses, we might take a different approach. So how interested would the city folks be, the stakeholders, in creating separate standards for form and separate standards for use and allowing them to be combined in a lot of different ways? Is that something you think we should look at? Yes, no, no opinion or other. It actually gets to, I think, Mr. Martin's earliest comment about, is this going to be a form-based code or is this going to be a use-based code? In my opinion, that we really need to think about both. So we'll give that about 5 seconds. Alrighty, I know this one's a little complicated. All right, so good. Looks like there's definitely interest in that. Well, those conclude the questions. I would like to just make a few closing remarks. We have 1 minute. First, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Yinka, can I have screen sharing ability so I can put the final slide? I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and encourage folks to please join the next meeting, which is going to be held on the 9th, a week from, next Tuesday, where we're going to be talking about issues of sustainability. Some of you had actually asked about how are we going to think about climate change and global warming and all of that, as well as affordable housing, as well as small business preservation. All of that is sort of going to feed into the process. But if you're interested in that kind of thing, sustainability, please join us next week. And then finally, look at the project website for details. As was mentioned, the analysis is on there. There are several hundred pages of it for you to review. Call the hotline if you have questions. Shoot us an email. Again, Director Holmes and myself receive all of the emails. And let us know if you are interested in hosting a viewing party for any of these in the future. Again, I thank you very, very much for your time. I think we've had some fantastic conversation. Just really, really good stuff. And again, as I mentioned before, we are committed as a team to having these hard conversations early on in the process and helping you help us ensure that the process is meaningfully participatory. So thank you again. I look forward to seeing you at a future meeting.
Good night, everyone. See you next week.